Hello, all. This is Dr. Johnson, and this is your recording or your lecture on Mencius. I'm going to put this full screen so you can see it a little better. And just like we try to do with all of our readings thus far that we've done, we're trying to go through those 4 steps of appropriate reading for understanding what you're reading well. So we want to look at the background, the context. We want to help you interpret what you're reading and engage with it. So let's start with a little bit of background information. So first of all, here's some context for the excerpt from, I have Menza here, but I'm going to call him Mencius, or Mencius, which was his Latinized name for the rest of the lecture. So what we need to understand about Mencius's time is that he wrote during a time of profound social upheaval, in which all of these states of China, these different states, were at almost constant war with each other. And in some ways, there might be some similarities to the political atmosphere we're experiencing now. So on the one hand, there aren't people at literal war with each other in the United States, as in, they're not invading other states and taking people captive and that sort of thing. But we do know that there's a lot of contention between political parties right now and a lot of just intense feelings. And so there might be some ways in which Mencius's time period is a little bit similar to ours. But one of the things that we want to notice is because the time that Mencius wrote in China was in such a state of turmoil, people were concerned more than ever about how they could best ensure political stability. That makes complete sense. If you live in a time of constant turmoil and political upheaval, what you want is for things to be more stable, more peaceful, more harmonious. Well, because people were so concerned about political stability, they started being concerned about human nature quite a bit and whether human nature was actually naturally good or evil. And it's pretty easy to understand why this was a big concern of theirs, because obviously the political unrest of the time didn't just pop out of nowhere. It was actually fomented and stirred up by different people with rival views of what should be the case in life and how people should be. And certainly as Mencius looked at these different people, he certainly noticed, and so did his colleagues and his friends and his fellow philosophers, they noticed that some people had really bad goals and really, really bad views about how things should be. And so this is why this question about human nature and how people become good, or how we can best shape them to have good virtues and good character so they help contribute to political stability rather than undermine it. This was a big question of concern for people. Well, something else you should know about Mencius is that he was a follower of Confucius. And Confucius was an Asian philosopher and scholar who was extremely concerned about proper rites and rituals and observances. So we're not reading Confucius this year, but if we did read Confucius, you would note, so Confucius wrote a book called the Analects, and you can actually Google this online, Confucius's Analects. And if you read through the Analects, what's so interesting about it is that you find that Confucius is really concerned about things like the right way to treat your parents and the right way to drink tea and the right way to store a mat that you have been sitting on. And the Analects are full of these proper ways to do these very mundane activities. And you might wonder, well, why in the world did Confucius care about all these things? And it was because Confucius believed that if people could learn proper rites and rituals and observances, that they could become better people and that this would lead to political stability. Well, what's really interesting is that different followers of Confucius interpreted his emphasis on rites, rituals, and observances differently. So, some of Confucius's followers thought that his emphasis on these things meant that human nature was bad, and that was why it must be controlled with strict rites and rituals. But other followers of Confucius, like Mencius, thought it meant that human nature was good and that its natural good could be brought out by rites and rituals. And so, what we're actually going to look at in this reading today is we are going to look at a series of dialogues between Mencius and another Confucian student named Gaozi. And there are some other interlocutors, some other dialogue partners mentioned in the excerpt too, but we're mainly going to focus on Mencius and Gaozi. So Gaozi was another Confucian student, but in contrast to Mencius, Gaozi believed that human nature was naturally evil and corrupt. And you're going to notice that Mencius and Gaozi often use different items in nature to explore the characteristics of human beings and human nature. And I think they do that because frequently human nature, when we think about it, we find it to be a really abstract concept. There's no actually tangible thing that we can put our hands on and hold and look at it that is human nature to figure out, for instance, if it's naturally good and evil. So it's really helpful to have things that we can compare it to help understand what it's like. And nature can be really helpful for these purposes. So what you're going to notice is that we're going to actually look at 5 different sections or 5 little mini dialogues in which Mencius and Gaozi, and most of them, are exploring the nature of human beings. All right, so let's go ahead and look at section 1. So in section 1, you're going to notice that Mencius and Gaozi are looking at human nature by comparing it to a willow tree. And Gaozi's point is that we make these beautiful wooden bowls and beautiful cups out of wood. But to do that, we have to hack up these trees. And we have to do quite a bit of carving and changing of the trees to make them these beautiful bowls. And so what Gaozi is trying to help us think here is that if human nature is like these bowls in any way, well, he thinks that we have to do quite a bit of carving, quite a bit of hacking up in order to be able to bring forth this beautiful product. So the idea would be, if you want beautiful human beings like beautiful human bowls, this requires quite a bit of hacking up, carving, and shaping. But Mencius's concern is this. He points out that when you hack up a tree to get a bowl, you're going against the grain of the wood. And this really does require quite a bit of hacking, quite a bit of carving up. And I think Mencius's concern could be stated in a question for you to think about. And one way you could state this question is, what are the differences between trees and the human spirit, so that you could perhaps carve or hack up one, but you couldn't really do that to the other one? What might be some of those differences? And one way we might think about that is to consider that there's a way that trees and wood can maintain their integrity and their goodness and their strength, even when they're carved up into really different items like bowls and like cups. But I think Mencius's concern is that the human spirit isn't quite like that. It's not actually a thing that you can carve and cut up and have it still maintain its integrity. And so I think Mencius's concern is that if we do that to human beings, if we do that to their spirit, there's a danger that we are going to do some significant damage to their overall integrity and strength of spirit. In section 2, we see another comparison with nature. So Gaozi compares human nature to water, and he says human nature makes no distinction between good and bad, just as water makes no distinction between east and west. And if this is the case, that human nature makes no distinction between good and bad, what this seems to mean is that perhaps what water requires, what human nature requires, is a great deal of external direction, a great deal of molding and changing and directing. But Mencius points out, well, but look, water might not make a distinction between east and west, but certainly it does between up and down. And in fact, water, unless prevented, will always travel downwards. It always flows downwards. And he thinks that human nature is like this too. And you might think that when Mencius says that water travels downward always unless prevented, and human nature is like that perhaps he's suggesting then that human nature is bad. But I think he actually is suggesting that human nature often naturally flows towards the good, towards compassion, towards kindness, unless it's disrupted or prevented or hindered in some way. And he says, surely, speaking of water again, you can splash the water and make it spring up. But that's only if you really disrupt the water and apply quite a bit of force to it. And I think he's comparing the splashing up to the water of violent outbreaks in human beings. And so his point would be that violence and anger and acting out and being cruel, those can happen in human beings, but only if some type of external force or disturbance is applied to them. When they're left to themselves, they naturally tend to flow downwards like water. And think about this way, there's a way that water is gentle and peaceful. Think about if you've ever walked by a peaceful or gentle stream. I have one that I walk by a lot near my house. That water is such an apt metaphor, it seems, for a natural kind of goodness, compassion, kindness, beauty, spontaneity. And Mencius thinks that we have that unless we're disrupted by some kind of outside force. All right. Well, in the next section, we see yet another nature example. So in the first one, we had trees being carved up into bowls. In the second section we just looked at a minute ago, we had water and its natural tendencies. And here, what we're looking at is seeds of goodness. So Laozi's claim is that men, well, he actually has two claims. He says, first, probably men, human beings, don't really have any original nature. Rather, they can become either good or bad, depending on how they're influenced. And you'll notice this is actually a conclusion with a really clear premise. So his conclusion is men can become either good or bad depending on how they are influenced. His premise is, this is as evidence, well, look, there are people who become violent under, that should be bad rulers, sorry, not band rulers. It's kind of a funny phrase there. Definitely don't mean band rulers. So I don't have anything against band rulers, and I'm sure that there are a lot of good band rulers that just, organize their band just fine. So people can become violent under bad rulers, and people can become good under good rulers. And then Gaozi's second claim is, well, okay, maybe we do have a nature, and some people are either born good and some are born bad. So that would be his second conclusion, his second claim. And his premise to that is, well, okay, so look, so that's why you can have bad children, for example, of good parents, or that's why you could have a good ruler but bad subjects. And so I'd like to point out that Gaozi is exploring two potential ideas. One, that man's nature isn't really anything either way, but can become good or bad depending on how it's influenced, or that man's nature actually is either good or bad. Some are good, some are bad, and you start to see that as they live on in life. And he gives, again, two premises to support that. Well, Mencius wants to critique both of those claims. And what he says is that rather than thinking that man's nature has no original state, or that some men are born good and some men are born bad, and please think of human beings when I say men here. So Mencius is writing in a very patriarchal time when, unfortunately, people in writing use the word man to stand for all of humankind, which is not necessarily a great thing to do because it excludes a lot of people from the conversation. So Mencius's claim is rather that we actually all have seeds of goodness in us, every one of us, and that when we focus on them, they grow more, and when we don't, they don't grow as much. And what's interesting with this claim is this seems to actually explain Gautz's two kind of conflicting claims. For instance, when Gautz said, hey, look, people become violent under bad rulers and they become good under good rulers. And so he assumed, well, men can become either good or bad depending on how they're influenced. Well, Mencius's claim actually fits quite well with the evidence. So when he would say, I believe that when we have violent rulers, those violent rulers discourage us from thinking of the seeds of goodness in us. And when we have good rulers, well, those good rulers encourage us to think about the seeds of goodness, and that's why they grow. But on the second hand, or on referring to Gauch's second argument, I think Mencius's claim fits well with this example that you can have good parents but have bad children. Why? Well, because parents may encourage their children to focus on and water the seeds of goodness in them, but children still have some mind of their own or some free will of their own. And so they might ignore their parents' influence and instead neglect their seeds of goodness. And that's why you can have good parents who have children who act very cruelly sometimes or badly. We're kind of thinking grown children here, I think, is the example. All right. So Mencius continues this exploration of, or this analogy, this allegory of human nature and plants. And Mencius points out, to prove his point that human nature has these seeds of goodness in it, that when when the harvest is good, men are good, and when the harvest is bad, men are bad. And what he means by that, so we were talking about metaphorical seeds of goodness, and now we're talking about actual seeds and plants here. What he's trying to point out is, so look, when the harvest is good, human beings have full bellies, they feel optimistic about life, they feel in control, they feel hopeful. And when human beings are in that state, it's easier for them to focus on and encourage the seeds of goodness in themselves. But on the other hand, when the harvest is bad, people are hungry, they're hopeless, they're full of despair, and it's really hard to water the seeds of goodness in yourself when you're having these very painful feelings. And Mencius is trying to point out that our circumstances in life can discourage or encourage the seeds of goodness in us. But he also points out, as another piece of evidence to support his notion that we all have these seeds of goodness in us, that all of us have similar feet and taste and delight in music. And here's what we mean. So on the one hand, we all might like different kinds of shoes, but we still have this idea of what shoes are and how they function with feet and what they're supposed to do with feet. And by the same token, referring to taste, we might like different kinds of foods, but for instance, no human being thinks, generally speaking, that tree bark is just an excellent food to eat, or that gasoline is a wonderful drink to ingest. So despite the variety of foods that we like, there are still pretty clear parameters to what we all think counts as good food and what doesn't. And by the same token, we all might have a pretty different view of the kind of music we like best. But most of us are not going to, for instance, think that a train whistle counts as music, or dogs barking, that counts as really good music. And that's not to say that we might not find beauty in a train whistle or in the sound of a dog barking, perhaps, although I don't know too many people who like the sound of dogs barking. The point is we definitely have an idea of what we think counts as music and what does not. And so Mitch's point here is that despite the differences in us, we have pretty strong similarities, for instance, about what we think about shoes and how they work with feet, our taste in food, our delight in music. And Mencha asks, why would we, or why should we not assume that our hearts are similar too? And in saying this, I think he means we might have some different ideas about how best to be kind or compassionate or to pursue goodness in our life. But generally speaking, we generally agree that, for example, punching a stranger in the face just because you don't like them is not a kind thing to do. Or that, for instance, taking away a baby's toy just to be mean, that's not a kind thing to do. Now, granted, some people may still engage in these bad actions, but often when they do and they're called out for it, they have a sense of shame or they express some acknowledgement that they've done a bad thing. And that's because Mencius would say, we have similar hearts. We have these seeds of potential in us. We know the right thing to do, even though sometimes we fail to do it. And so he's pointing to this originally good nature we have. So one way you could think about this is that most people have a conscience, and most people have some really strong similarities in what their conscience tells them is right or wrong. All right, here's Mencius's last point or piece of evidence to support his conclusion that human nature is naturally good. He points out that landscapes, like for instance, a wooded forest, are naturally beautiful, but that people can come and chop down trees and deforest them and completely destroy the landscape. But when landscapes are destroyed and we look at them and their devastation, we recognize that the devastation of that landscape is not because of something inherently wrong with that landscape. Rather, we realize that how the landscape has been treated has destroyed the beauty of the landscape. And so Mencius asks us to consider that that's the same way it is with human beings, that there is no human being that is not capable of inner beauty, but that how human beings are treated and cultivated can destroy or enhance this capability. And I think Mencius is asking us to consider that when we see a human whose virtue, like their character, has been ruined and they're doing these horrible things, we should not look at them and think, oh, that's because there's something inherently wrong with this person. Rather, we should look at them and recognize that somebody has destroyed them in the landscape of their character. So, one thing that you could do today is to go back and look at the PowerPoint on Mencius. It's available to you down at the bottom of Module 2. And you'll also find a video on Mencius you can watch. And it would be good for you to spend some time interpreting and engaging with it. And you could do that by either thinking about or writing about these questions. So what does Mencius mean exactly when he says that man's nature is good? Because there are some nuances to it. And to help you trace out these nuances, you might consider, this is the second question, what role does the concept of potential play in Mencius's conception of the goodness of human nature? That should have a question mark by it. And then lastly, you can engage with this material and ask yourself, do you agree with this view of human beings? Are humans by nature good in the way Mencius describes it, which is tied strongly to his notion of the seeds of goodness? Why or why not? What evidence would you bring to support your point? Thanks for listening.